The dust-covered letter trembled in Harriet Edelson's hands as tears blurred the carefully penned words announcing her husband's death. 3 years of marriage ended with 8 simple words. "We regret to inform you of his passing." The small cabin that had once felt like a prison now seemed impossibly empty as the autumn wind of 1872 rattled the windows of her Colorado homestead. Harriet folded the letter, tucking it away in the pocket of her worn dress. At 24, she never imagined being a widow. Thomas had been a good man, if not the passionate love she'd dreamed of as a girl. Their marriage had been one of convenience and mutual respect. He needed a wife to help with his land claim, and she needed to escape her overbearing father in Boston. Now she was alone with 40 acres, a few chickens, and memories that were already fading like morning mist. "Miss Harriet, you in there?" The familiar voice of Emmett Baker, her nearest neighbor, called from outside. Wiping her eyes quickly, Harriet straightened her spine and opened the door. "Mr. Baker, what brings you by?" The elderly man removed his hat, revealing wisps of white hair. "Got word from town, heard about Thomas. I'm mighty sorry." "Thank you." The words felt hollow in her mouth. "Thing is, Miss Harriet, a woman alone." He shuffled his feet. "Winter's coming. You ought to consider selling this place. My son would give you a fair price." The suggestion landed like a physical blow. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Baker, but I'll manage." She kept her voice even despite the panic rising in her chest. After he left, Harriet sank into Thomas's chair by the fireplace. Sell the homestead. It was all she had left. She had nowhere to return to. Her father had made it clear she was no longer welcome after she'd refused the wealthy banker he'd chosen for her. The homestead represented her independence, her chance to prove she could survive without being under a man's thumb. Morning light spilled through the cabin windows as Harriet faced the unforgiving truth. She had 3 months of supplies, winter approaching, and no idea how to run a cattle operation alone. Thomas had been teaching her, but there was so much she didn't know. The small herd needed tending, fences needed mending, and predators threatened their livestock daily. She spent the morning tallying their meager savings and supplies, reality pressing down with each item counted. By noon, the weight of her situation drove her outside where she could breathe. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, majestic and indifferent to her troubles. Harriet was checking the chicken coop when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Grabbing Thomas's rifle from beside the door, she waited nervously. Visitors were rare, and strangers even rarer. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the tree line. The stranger rode confidently, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the azure sky. As he drew closer, Harriet could make out a strong-jawed face partially obscured by several days' worth of beard. His clothes were trail-worn but clean denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a dust-covered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. "Madam." He tipped his hat as he reined his horse to a stop. "Name's Vaughn Quincy, looking for Thomas Edelson." Harriet lowered the rifle slightly but kept it visible. "Mr. Edelson isn't here." The man Vaughn studied her face. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "When do you expect him back?" "Never," she replied, the word catching in her throat. "He's dead, 3 weeks now." Something flickered across Vaughn's face, surprise, perhaps regret. "I'm sorry to hear that, madam. I was told he might have work." "Well, he doesn't." Harriet turned to go back inside, then paused. An idea was forming, desperate but possible. "Unless..." She faced him again. "Are you a ranch hand, Mr. Quincy?" "Been working cattle since I was 14. Just finished a drive up from Texas." He dismounted with fluid grace despite his tall frame. "Was hoping to find something more permanent before winter." Harriet studied him. He stood straight, meeting her gaze directly, a good sign. His hands were calloused, his frame solid. "I need help with the cattle. I can't pay much, but there's room in the barn and meals included." Vaughn considered her offer, looking around the modest homestead. "How many head?" 23. "Plus chickens and 2 horses." He nodded slowly. "That's not much of a herd." "It's all I have," she replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. His expression softened slightly. "I didn't mean offense, Mrs. Edelson, just getting the lay of the land." Harriet wasn't sure if it was desperation or something in his straightforward manner, but she made her decision. "Can you start today?" "Yes, madam." The barn has a small room at the back. It's not much, but it's dry. She hesitated. I should warn you, Mr. Quincy, I can only guarantee work through winter. After that, one day at a time, Mrs. Edelson. He offered his hand. Do we have an agreement? His palm was warm and rough against hers. We do, and it's Miss Edelson now, I suppose. Vaughn nodded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. I'll tend to my horse and get settled, then see about those cattle. As Harriet watched him lead his chestnut gelding toward the barn, she wondered if she'd just made a terrible mistake. Hiring a stranger, a man she knew nothing about, went against every cautious bone in her body. But winter was coming, and she was out of options. She returned to the cabin and moved Thomas's rifle to a more accessible spot near her bed. Just in case, Vaughn proved himself useful immediately. By sunset, he'd fixed a section of fence that had been troubling Thomas for weeks, moved the cattle to fresh grazing, and identified a leak in the barn roof that could become problematic with winter snows. At supper time, Harriet called him in from the barn. He washed up at the pump outside, his dark hair damp and curling slightly at his collar as he ducked through her doorway. This is kind of you, he said, taking the seat she indicated at the small table. It's part of our arrangement, she replied, serving a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved venison. I'm not much of a cook, I'm afraid. After trail food, this is a feast. His smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a warmth she hadn't noticed before. They ate in silence for a while before Harriet worked up the courage to ask. Where are you from originally, Mr. Quincy? Virginia, originally. Left after the war. He didn't elaborate, and Harriet didn't press. Many men carried scars from those terrible years, both visible and hidden, and you've been driving cattle since then, among other things. He took a sip of coffee, tried my hand at mining for a spell, did some work as a farrier. Even rode with the Pony Express before it folded. You've lived quite the adventurous life. Something like regret crossed his features. Just never found a reason to stay in one place. What about you? You're not from around here originally. Boston, she admitted. I came west with Thomas 3 years ago. That's quite a change. Harriet thought about the stifling drawing rooms and rigid expectations she'd left behind. It was exactly what I wanted. Vaughn seemed to consider this. Most Easterners find the territory too rough. I found Boston too constraining, she countered. At least here I can breathe. After dinner, Vaughn excused himself to check on his horse, leaving Harriet alone with her thoughts. She hadn't expected to find her new ranch hand so easy to talk to. It had been months since she'd had a real conversation with anyone besides Thomas, and those had grown increasingly sparse as he'd become consumed with making the ranch profitable. The next morning, Harriet woke before dawn to find the fire already lit and coffee brewing. Vaughn had risen earlier and was nowhere to be seen. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped outside to find him examining the chicken coop. These boards are rotting, he said without preamble. Fox could get in easy. I'll rebuild it today. The cattle already moved them to the south pasture. Better grass there. I checked the creek, 2 waters running clear. Harriet was both impressed and slightly unsettled by his efficiency. You've been busy. Sun's up, so am I, he straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. Found some lumber in the barn that'll work for the coop, unless you had other plans for it. No, that's fine, she hesitated. I should tell you, Mr. Quincy, I don't know much about ranching. Thomas handled most of it. Vaughn nodded, no judgment in his expression. You'll learn. Cattle aren't complicated, just stubborn, like people. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Over the following days, a rhythm developed. Vaughn would be up and working before Harriet stirred, taking care of the morning chores. They would eat breakfast together, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing bits of conversation. Then they would work separately, Vaughn on the endless tasks of the ranch, Harriet with her household duties and garden, which needed harvesting before the first frost. In the evenings, they would share a simple meal. Occasionally, Vaughn would tell stories of places he'd seen: the vast deserts of Arizona Territory, the towering redwoods of California, the rugged beauty of Montana. Harriet found herself looking forward to these tales, glimpses of a world beyond her limited experience. A week into this new arrangement, Harriet was gathering eggs when she heard a commotion from the pasture. She rushed toward the sound to find Vaughn wrestling with their bull, Samson, who had somehow gotten his massive head trapped in the fence. "Stay back," Vaughn shouted when he saw her approaching. The bull thrashed, his powerful body a danger to anyone nearby. Ignoring his warning, Harriet circled wide and grabbed a rope hanging from the fence post. "What do you need me to do?" Vaughn shot her a surprised look. "Loop that around his back legs if you can get close enough. Careful." Moving cautiously, Harriet approached from behind. Samson was focused on Vaughn, who kept a firm grip on his horns while speaking in low, soothing tones. With a deep breath, Harriet darted in and managed to loop the rope around one of the bull's hind legs. "Pull," Vaughn instructed. She threw her weight against the rope, creating enough tension to momentarily unbalance Samson. In that instant, Vaughn twisted the bull's head and freed it from the fence. The animal immediately bolted away, dragging Harriet several feet before she had the sense to release the rope. Vaughn was at her side instantly. "Are you hurt?" "Just my pride," she gasped, letting him help her to her feet. His hands were strong and steady on her arms. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said, his voice stern but his eyes showing something like admiration. "Probably both," Harriet admitted, becoming acutely aware of how close they were standing. She stepped back, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Thank you for your help with Samson." "Thank you for yours." He gave her a long look. "Most women would have run the other way." "I'm not most women, Mr. Quincy." "No," he agreed quietly. "You certainly are not, Miss Edelson." That night, Harriet found it difficult to sleep. The moment with Vaughn kept replaying in her mind the strength in his hands, the flash of admiration in his eyes. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. Thomas had been kind, but their marriage had lacked passion. Their union had been practical, their intimacy perfunctory and increasingly rare. She pushed the thoughts away, ashamed of herself. Thomas was barely cold in his grave, and here she was, noticing another man's hands. What kind of widow did that make her? The following morning, dark clouds rolled in from the mountains, bringing with them a biting wind that promised snow. Harriet hurried to secure the last of her garden harvest, while Vaughn reinforced the barn doors and brought in extra hay for the animals. By midday, the first flakes were falling. By evening, the world was white, and the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing seeking entry. "Storms setting in early this year," Vaughn commented as they sat by the fire after dinner. "Good thing we got the roof patched." Harriet nodded, watching the flames dance. "Will the cattle be all right? They'll huddle together in the shelter of the trees." "Cattle have survived winters long before fences and barns." He prodded the fire with a stick. "But I'll check on them at first light. If the snow lets up," Harriet added. Vaughn smiled slightly. "Weather doesn't much care about our plans, Miss Edelson." The storm raged for 3 days. Confined to the cabin, except for brief excursions to tend to the animals, Harriet and Vaughn found themselves in closer quarters than ever before. They played cards, Harriet mended clothes, and Vaughn whittled pieces of wood into surprisingly delicate figures: a bird in flight, a prancing horse, a woman with flowing hair. "That's beautiful," Harriet said, watching his knife shave away thin curls of wood. "Where did you learn to carve like that?" "My grandfather taught me," said. "Idle hands led to trouble, so he made sure mine stayed busy." Vaughn turned the small wooden bird over, examining it critically. "Never thought I'd have much use for the skill, but it passes the time. May I?" Harriet held out her hand, and he placed the carving in her palm. The wood was smooth, the details precise. "You have an artist's touch, Mr. Quincy." "Vaughn," he said suddenly, "after 3 days trapped in this cabin together, I think you might as well use my given name." Harriet smiled. "Very well, and I'm Harriet." "Harriet," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "It suits you, strong but elegant." She felt herself flush and quickly changed the subject. "Tell me about Virginia. What was it like growing up there?" A shadow crossed his face. "Beautiful country. Rolling hills, forests so green they hurt your eyes. My family had a small horse farm near Lexington." "Do you miss it?" "Every day," he admitted, "but it's not the same place anymore. War changes things, changes people." "You fought Confederate cavalry." He said it without pride or apology, simply stating a fact. Joined up at 18, fought Tilapamatox, came home to find everything gone, farm burned, parents dead from fever, sister married and moved west. I'm sorry, Harriet said softly. Vaughn shrugged. Long time ago now, what about you? What made you leave Boston for this? He gestured to the humble cabin around them. Harriet considered how much to share. My father arranged a marriage for me. The man was wealthy, respected, and 30 years my senior. When I refused, my father threatened to disown me. So you called his bluff. It wasn't a bluff. Harriet stared into the fire. I met Thomas at a lecture about the Homestead Act. He was planning to come west, needed a wife to help establish his claim. I needed an escape. We made an arrangement. A marriage of convenience, Vaughn supplied. Yes, though I grew fond of him. He was kind, hardworking. She twisted her wedding ring. Not the love match I dreamed of as a girl, but he gave me freedom. That was worth more than romance. Vaughn was quiet for a long moment. And now, what do you dream of now? The question caught her off guard. What did she want? For so long, survival had been her only goal. To keep this place, she finally said. To make it thrive. To never have to depend on anyone else's charity or goodwill. Independence, Vaughn nodded. I understand that hunger well enough. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. The morning sun turned the snow into a sea of diamonds, so bright it hurt the eyes. Vaughn spent most of the day checking on the cattle and repairing minor damage from the storm. Harriet took the opportunity to visit Thomas's grave, a simple marker on a small rise behind the cabin. She brushed snow from the wooden cross, feeling strangely distant from the man buried beneath. I'm trying, Thomas, she whispered. I'm trying to keep your dream alive. But as she walked back to the cabin, she realized it wasn't just Thomas's dream anymore. Somewhere along the way, this place had become hers too, not because she'd married a man who owned it, but because she'd poured her own sweat and tears into the soil. As November deepened, Harriet and Vaughn fell into a comfortable routine. He taught her about cattle, how to read their behavior, treat common ailments, predict when a cow would calve. She found herself enjoying the work, taking pride in each new skill mastered. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Harriet voiced a question that had been nagging at her. Why did you really come here, Vaughn? A man with your skills could find work on any of the big ranches. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. I knew your husband, he finally said. Not well, but we rode together briefly on a cattle drive last spring. Harriet stared at him. You never said. Didn't seem like the right time when I first arrived. Vaughn met her gaze directly. He spoke about this place, about his wife who'd given up everything to come west with him, said if I ever needed honest work, he'd have a place for me. Why didn't you come sooner? Took a job with the Baldwin outfit first, better pay. He looked down at his hands. By the time I heard they were hiring again, it was too late. Only learned about Thomas's passing when I arrived. Harriet processed this revelation. So you stayed out of obligation because you felt you owed something to Thomas. At first, maybe. Vaughn's voice was quiet, but not anymore. The implications of his words hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Harriet felt her heart quicken. I should get some rest, she said, rising abruptly. Good night, Vaughn. Good night, Harriet. In her small bedroom, Harriet lay awake for hours, her thoughts in turmoil. She was attracted to Vaughn, she could admit that to herself now. But was it real, or simply the result of their isolation? And even if it was real, what then? She was a widow of barely 2 months. What would people think? The practical side of her argued that out here, conventional rules meant little. Winter was setting in, and 2 people stood a better chance than one alone. But her heart was more cautious, scarred from her parents' rejection and a marriage that, while respectful, had lacked the passion she'd once hoped for. December arrived with a biting cold that penetrated the cabin despite the constant fire. Christmas approached, and Harriet found herself wanting to mark the holiday somehow, to create a moment of brightness in the long winter. On Christmas Eve, she baked bread using precious stored flour and made a simple stew with dried venison and the last of her root vegetables. She even found candles tucked away in a trunk, saved for special occasions. When Vaughn came in from evening chores, he stopped in the doorway, surprise evident on his face at the transformed cabin. Candles glowed on the table, which was set with Harriet's only tablecloth, a piece of faded linen brought from Boston. "What's all this?" he asked, removing his hat. "It's Christmas Eve," Harriet said, suddenly feeling foolish. "I thought we might celebrate a little." His expression softened. "It's been a long time since I marked the day." "Me too," she admitted. Thomas wasn't one for holidays. After washing up, Vaughn joined her at the table. The meal was simple, but the atmosphere transformed by candlelight and the small effort at festivity. They talked easily, sharing memories of Christmases past. Vaughn spoke of Virginia traditions, the greenery brought indoors, special cakes his mother would bake, the midnight service at the small country church. "What about you?" he asked. "What was Christmas like in your Boston home?" Harriet described elaborate parties, gifts exchanged, carols around the piano. "But it was all for show," she added. "My father saw it as a business opportunity, a chance to impress clients and make connections. There wasn't much genuine Christmas spirit." After dinner, Vaughn disappeared briefly to the barn, returning with something hidden behind his back. "I have something for you," he said, almost shyly. "It's not much, but—" He held out a small wooden carving, a perfect miniature of the cabin, complete with tiny details like the crooked chimney and the split rail fence. "Vaughn," Harriet breathed, taking it carefully. "It's beautiful. Thought you might like a keepsake. Something to remember this place by, whatever happens." She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched by the hours of work the gift represented. "I have something for you too, though it's nowhere near as thoughtful." Harriet retrieved a package wrapped in brown paper from her bedroom. "It's just a scarf I knitted. The nights in the barn must be cold." Vaughn unwrapped the simple blue scarf, his expression one of genuine pleasure. "No one's made me anything in years." He wrapped it around his neck. "Thank you, Harriet." They sat by the fire afterward, the cabin quiet except for the crackling of burning logs. Harriet found herself studying Vaughn's profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eye, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her gaze. "That I'm glad you came," she answered honestly. "I don't think I would have made it through winter alone." "You're stronger than you know," Vaughn said, "but I'm glad I came too." Their eyes held for a long moment. Harriet felt something shift between them, a tension that had been building for weeks finally acknowledged. Vaughn leaned forward slightly, hesitating. The moment was broken by a loud crack from the fire, sending sparks flying. Harriet jumped up to ensure nothing had caught, and when she turned back, the spell was broken. Vaughn stood too, gathering his coat. "I should get back to the barn," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Early start tomorrow. Merry Christmas, Harriet. Merry Christmas, Vaughn." Alone in her bed that night, Harriet touched her lips, wondering what it would have felt like if he had kissed her. The guilt she expected to feel didn't come. Instead, she felt a quiet certainty that Thomas would not have begrudged her finding happiness again. January brought the deepest cold, days when the sun seemed to give no warmth at all. Harriet and Vaughn worked side by side to keep the animals fed and the cabin warm. Their supplies dwindled steadily, flour running low, salt becoming precious, coffee a rare treat rather than a daily staple. "We need to make a trip to town," Vaughn said one evening as they inventoried their remaining stores. "Before we're completely snowed in." Harriet hadn't been to Willow Creek since before Thomas's death. The prospect of facing the small community as a widow was daunting. "Is it safe to travel?" "Weather's clear for now. We can make it there and back in a day if we start early." Harriet questioned. "I'm not letting you make that trip alone," Vaughn said firmly. "Roads dangerous this time of year." The next morning they set out before dawn in Thomas's old wagon. Harriet wore every layer she owned against the biting cold, and Vaughn insisted she take a heated brick wrapped in flannel to keep her feet warm. The journey was slow, the wagon wheels struggling through patches of snow and mud. Harriet found herself grateful for Vaughn's steady presence beside her, his occasional comments about the landscape or memories of other winter journeys breaking the monotony. Willow Creek appeared in the distance around midday, a small collection of buildings nestled in a valley. As they approached, Harriet felt her anxiety rise. It had been months since she'd spoken to anyone besides Vaughn. "You all right?" he asked, noticing her tension. Just preparing myself. People talk. A widow living alone with a man not her husband. Vaughn's expression hardened slightly. You've done nothing wrong, Harriet. You hired help to survive the winter. Anyone who can't understand that isn't worth worrying about. His defense warmed her more than the brick at her feet. Thank you. The town was quiet, just a few people moving between buildings. Vaughn helped Harriet down from the wagon in front of the general store, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Inside, the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Gunderson, looked up in surprise. Mrs. Edelson, we weren't sure you'd made it through that first blizzard. It's been a difficult winter, Harriet acknowledged, but we're managing. Mrs. Gunderson's eyes flicked to Vaughn, who stood respectfully behind Harriet. And who might this be? Vaughn Quincy, madam. He tipped his hat. Working for Miss Edelson through the winter. Harriet didn't miss the speculative look that crossed the older woman's face. We need supplies, she said briskly, producing her list. Whatever you can spare. While Mrs. Gunderson gathered their order, Harriet heard the store's bell jingle as someone else entered. She turned to see Emmett Baker and his son, James. Mrs. Edelson, Emmett said, surprise evident in his voice. Didn't expect to see you in town. Mr. Baker. Harriet nodded politely. We needed supplies. James Baker's eyes were fixed on Vaughn. Hired help, huh? Must be expensive keeping a man on through winter. Worth every penny, Harriet replied coolly. Mr. Quincy has been invaluable, James smirked. I bet he has. Vaughn stepped forward, his posture relaxed but something dangerous in his eyes. Something you want to say directly to me, Baker. The younger Baker seemed to reconsider his attitude. No offense meant. None taken then. Vaughn's tone made it clear the discussion was over. The rest of the transaction proceeded in awkward silence. Once their supplies were loaded, Harriet and Vaughn visited the post office, where a letter from Harriet's sister in Boston awaited. Then they stopped at the saloon for a hot meal before beginning the journey home. The sun was already low when they started back, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Harriet was quiet, her mind on the encounter in the store. Don't let them bother you, Vaughn finally said. Small towns run on gossip. It's not that, Harriet sighed. It's just... I've spent my whole life worrying about what others think. I left Boston to escape those judgments, yet here I am, still concerned with appearances. What do you want, Harriet? Vaughn asked. Not what others expect, not what's proper, what do you want? The question hung in the cold air between them. What did she want? For the first time in years, Harriet allowed herself to consider the question without the filter of duty or propriety. I want to be happy, she said finally. I want this ranch to succeed, I want. She hesitated, then met his gaze directly. I want to stop being afraid of what I feel. Vaughn's eyes darkened. And what do you feel? Before she could answer, their horse whinnied sharply and lurched to the side. The wagon tilted dangerously as one wheel slipped off the icy road into a ditch. Hold on, Vaughn called, struggling with the reins. The wagon teetered for a moment, then tipped, sending them both tumbling into the snow. Harriet felt a sharp pain in her ankle as she landed, and the air rushed from her lungs. Vaughn was at her side instantly. Are you hurt? My ankle, she gasped. I think I twisted it. He examined it gently, his touch careful even through her boot and layers of stockings. Doesn't feel broken, but you shouldn't walk on it. The wagon's stuck, good wheels broken. Darkness was falling rapidly, the temperature dropping with the sun. We can't stay here, Harriet said, looking around at the empty landscape. There's a line shack about a mile back, Vaughn said. Belonged to the cattle company I worked for last year. Should be basic supplies their shelter at least. He unhitched their horse, secured their most essential supplies to its back, and helped Harriet mount. Then, leading the horse by its reins, he began walking through the deepening snow toward the shelter. The lined shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small stove, a rough table, and a narrow cot. But it was shelter from the wind that had begun to howl across the plains. Vaughn quickly built a fire in the rusty stove while Harriet huddled in a horse blanket, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Not exactly the Willard Hotel, Vaughn commented wryly as he melted snow for coffee. Better than freezing to death, Harriet managed through chattering teeth. Once the small space had warmed, Vaughn gently removed Harriet's boot to examine her ankle. It was swollen and beginning to bruise, but as he'd suspected, not broken. "Cold will help with the swelling," he said, wrapping it carefully in a strip of cloth torn from his own undershirt. "You should stay off it tomorrow. We can't stay here," Harriet protested. "The animals, they'll survive one more day. You're more important." His voice was firm but gentle. "We'll head back at first light. I'll rig something for the wagon." They shared a meager supper of jerky and hard biscuits found in the shack's supplies. The wind grew stronger outside, whistling through the cabin's chinks despite Vaughn's efforts to block them. "You should take the cot," Vaughn said as night deepened. "I'll be fine on the floor." Harriet looked at the narrow bed, then at the cold floor. "Don't be ridiculous. We'll both freeze if you sleep on the floor. The cot's small, but we can share it." Vaughn's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "Harriet." "It's practical," she said firmly, though her heart raced at the suggestion. "Nothing more." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. They arranged themselves awkwardly on the narrow cot, both fully clothed except for their boots, a blanket pulled over them. Harriet lay stiffly, acutely aware of Vaughn's body behind her, his breath warm on her neck. "Earlier," he said quietly, "before the accident, you were saying something." Harriet closed her eyes, gathering her courage. "I was going to say that I have feelings for you. That I've been fighting them because it seems too soon, because I'm supposed to be grieving Thomas, because it's not proper." Vaughn was silent for so long that Harriet feared she'd made a terrible mistake. Then his arm slipped around her waist, pulling her closer against him. "I've wanted to kiss you since that day with the bull," he admitted, his voice low. "When you came running with that rope, fearless as any man I've ever ridden with, but I didn't want to disrespect your mourning." Harriet turned in his arms to face him, their faces inches apart in the darkness. "I did mourn Thomas, but what I feel now, it's different, stronger. I never knew it could be like this." Vaughn's hand came up to touch her face, his fingers tracing her cheek with a gentleness that belied their strength. "Harriet," he whispered, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a demand. But when Harriet responded, sliding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more urgent. Years of loneliness and unfulfilled longing poured into that kiss, leaving them both breathless when they finally parted. "I've been fighting this," Vaughn confessed, his forehead resting against hers. "Telling myself you're my employer, that you're still grieving, that I have nothing to offer a woman like you." "I don't want offerings," Harriet said. "I want you just as you are." They kissed again, more slowly this time, exploring and learning each other. Harriet felt herself melting against him, all thoughts of propriety forgotten in the warmth of his embrace. "We should stop," Vaughn said reluctantly, pulling back slightly. "If we don't." Harriet understood. Despite their isolation, despite the intensity of their feelings, some lines shouldn't be crossed, not yet. "Hold me," she whispered. "Just hold me tonight." They slept tangled together, finding comfort in each other's warmth against the howling winter night. Morning brought clear skies and a renewed sense of purpose. Vaughn fashioned a temporary repair for the wagon wheel using materials from the line shack, and by midday, they were on their way back to the homestead. As they approached the familiar silhouette of the cabin, Harriet felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief at returning home, uncertainty about what would happen next between her and Vaughn, and a new, surprising feeling of hope. The animals had survived their absence, though the chickens complained loudly at being neglected. Vaughn insisted that Harriet rest her ankle while he unloaded supplies and tended to the livestock. That evening, sitting across from each other at the table, they both seemed unsure how to proceed after the intimacy of the previous night. About what happened, they both began simultaneously, then laughed. "Ladies first," Vaughn said. Harriet took a deep breath. "I don't regret it," she said firmly, "but I understand if you think it was a mistake, the cold, the danger, the isolation." "A mistake?" Vaughn's expression was incredulous. "Harriet, I've been falling in love with you since the day I arrived. The only mistake would be pretending otherwise." The word love hung in the air between them. Harriet hadn't expected it, hadn't dared hope for it. "Love," she repeated softly. "Yes, love," Vaughn confirmed, reaching across the table to take her hand. I love your courage, your determination, the way you face each challenge head-on. The way you look in the morning light with your hair falling loose around your shoulders." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes. "I never thought I'd feel this way," she admitted. "With Thomas, it was different, comfortable, safe. This is—" She searched for the right word. "Overwhelming." "In a good way, I hope," Vaughn said, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "In the best way." She squeezed his hand. "I love you too, Vaughn. It happened so gradually I didn't realize until it was already too late to stop it." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I don't want to rush you. After everything you've been through, you're not rushing me," Harriet interrupted. "If anything, I've been rushing myself, trying to understand how I could feel this strongly so soon after losing Thomas." "What did you realize?" "That grief and love can exist simultaneously. That honoring Thomas's memory doesn't mean denying my own heart." She met his gaze steadily. "And that life is too precious, too uncertain, to waste time denying happiness when it's offered." Vaughn rose from his chair, drawing Harriet to her feet and into his arms. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a promise, a beginning. As January gave way to February, Harriet and Vaughn settled into a new rhythm. By day, they worked side by side on the ranch. By night, they shared the cabin's main room, talking for hours before Vaughn reluctantly returned to his bed in the barn. Despite their confessed feelings, both agreed to move slowly, respecting the boundaries of propriety even in their isolation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Vaughn broached a subject they'd been avoiding. "Spring will be here soon." Harriet nodded, understanding the unspoken question. Their arrangement had been for the winter only. "What are your plans?" she asked, her heart tight with anxiety. Vaughn stared into the flames. "That depends." "On what, on you?" He turned to face her fully. "On what you want." Harriet took a deep breath. "I want you to stay, Vaughn, not as my hired hand but as my partner, in every way." A slow smile spread across his face. "Are you proposing to me, Harriet Edelson?" She laughed, relieved by his teasing tone. "I suppose I am, though it's hardly conventional. Nothing about us has been conventional." He took her hands in his. "But I want to do this right. When spring comes, when the road's clear, I want to go to town proper. Get a ring. Ask you properly with all the traditional words." "You don't need to, I want to," he insisted. "Not because society demands it, but because you deserve it. A proper courtship, a proper proposal. A fresh start, not just an extension of a winter arrangement." Harriet was touched by his insistence on doing things properly for her sake. "All right," she agreed. "A proper courtship it is." The last weeks of winter passed in a sweet haze. They worked together, planned for spring planting, and talked of the future. Vaughn proved to be a skilled rancher with ambitious ideas for expanding the herd and improving the bloodlines. Harriet found that her Eastern education had practical applications in keeping accounts and calculating the best times to buy and sell. In the evenings, they shared stories of their pasts, filling in the gaps of their histories. Harriet told Vaughn about her sheltered upbringing, her brief rebellion in attending suffragist meetings, her father's fury when she refused to marry his business associate. Vaughn spoke of his family's horse farm, his younger brother lost at Gettysburg, his wandering years after the war when he couldn't settle anywhere for long. "What changed?" Harriet asked one night. "What made you want to stop wandering?" Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "I was tired," he finally said. "Tired of having no roots, no purpose beyond the next paycheck. And then I met Thomas on that cattle drive, heard him talk about this place, about building something lasting." He looked at her. "And now I've found someone worth staying for." March brought the first signs of thaw, icicles dripping from the eaves, patches of mud appearing in the snow-covered yard, the unmistakable smell of earth awakening. With the warming weather came new life. 2 calves were born within days of each other, healthy and strong. "Good sign," Vaughn said as they watched the second calf take its first wobbly steps. "Herd's growing." Harriet leaned against the fence beside him, their shoulders touching. "Everything seems to be growing," she observed. "The days, the herd, our plans. Our family," Vaughn suggested softly. The words sent a warm flush through Harriet. "I'd like that," she admitted. "Children, a real family, me too." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "More than I ever thought possible." As the snow retreated, revealing green shoots beneath, they made plans for a trip to town. The wagon was properly repaired, the road mostly clear, and Harriet's ankle fully healed. Vaughn was uncharacteristically nervous the morning of their departure, checking and rechecking the wagon, fussing over Harriet's comfort. "What's gotten into you?" She laughed as he adjusted her shawl for the third time. "Want everything to be perfect," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. The journey to Willow Creek was considerably more pleasant than their winter trek. Spring wildflowers dotted the prairie, and birds sang in the clear blue sky. Harriet found herself smiling at the simple joy of being alive on such a day, with the man she loved beside her. The town was busier than during their winter visit, with freight wagons bringing supplies after the long isolation of winter. Harriet noticed curious glances as she and Vaughn made their way down the main street, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Their first stop was the bank, where Harriet needed to discuss her accounts and the loan Thomas had taken for cattle purchases. To her relief, the banker was professional and helpful, offering suggestions for managing the debt and even extending the terms when he heard of her plans to expand the herd. "Your husband had a good reputation, Mrs. Edelson," he said as they concluded their business. "Honest man, solid plans. I'm glad to see you continuing his work." "Thank you," Harriet replied, touched by the unexpected support. After the bank, Vaughn excused himself mysteriously, asking Harriet to meet him at the hotel restaurant in an hour. "Need to take care of something," he said vaguely. Harriet used the time to visit the general store, ordering seeds for her garden and checking prices on items they would need for the spring. Mrs. Gunderson was noticeably warmer than during their winter visit, asking after Harriet's health and offering condolences on her loss. "We were all shocked about Thomas," she said, wrapping Harriet's purchases. "Fine man, but it's good to see you managing, and that Mr. Quincy seems helpful." Harriet smiled at the obvious fishing for information. "Very helpful," she agreed, offering nothing more. At the appointed time, she made her way to the hotel restaurant, the only real dining establishment in Willow Creek. Vaughn was waiting outside, looking uncharacteristically formal in a clean shirt with his hair neatly combed. "You look handsome," Harriet said, suddenly self-conscious in her simple dress. "And you're beautiful," he replied, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The restaurant was modest by Eastern standards, but the finest Willow Creek had to offer. White cloths covered the tables, and actual glassware, not tin cups, held water and wine. Vaughn had secured a table by the window, away from the curious eyes of other diners. Over a meal of roast beef and potatoes, they talked easily about their plans for the ranch fencing the north pasture, building a proper chicken coop, adding a room to the cabin. As dessert arrived, apple pie with real cream, Harriet noticed Vaughn growing increasingly nervous. "Is something wrong?" she asked, concerned by his distraction. "No," he said quickly. "Nothing wrong, just—" He took a deep breath and reached into his pocket. "Harriet, I wanted to do this properly." Her heart began to race as he produced a small velvet box. "Vaughn, let me say this," he insisted gently. "I've rehearsed it all morning." She nodded, tears already threatening. "Harriet Edelson, when I rode onto your homestead last fall, I was just looking for work to get through winter. I never expected to find a home, or a heart as brave and true as yours." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. "I don't have much to offer except my hands, my heart, and my promise to stand beside you through whatever comes. Will you marry me?" The tears spilled over as Harriet nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Vaughn." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. "I had to guess the size," he admitted. "It's perfect." She admired the way the blue stone caught the light. "How did you?" "Been saving for years," he explained. "Never had a reason to spend it until now." They left the restaurant hand in hand, oblivious to the curious stares of townspeople. Their happiness was a tangible thing, surrounding them like a protective bubble against judgment or gossip. As they prepared to leave town, Harriet made one last stop at the small church at the end of the main street. The minister, Reverend Williams, was sweeping the steps when they approached. "Reverend," Harriet greeted him. "I'm Harriet Edelson. My husband Thomas passed away last fall." "Yes, of course." The older man nodded solemnly. A tragedy. How are you managing, Mrs. Edelson? Well, thank you. She glanced at Vaughn, who stood respectfully beside her. This is Vaughn Quincy. That is. She hesitated, uncertain how to explain. We're engaged to be married, Reverend, Vaughn supplied, his voice steady. We'd like to speak with you about performing the ceremony. The minister's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained kind. I see. When were you thinking? Late April, Harriet said. After the spring calving is finished. Reverend Williams considered them thoughtfully. Normally, I would suggest a longer period of mourning, he said carefully. But out here, practicalities often outweigh conventions and genuine affection. He smiled slightly. Well, that's never to be dismissed lightly. Relief flooded through Harriet. Then you'll do it. I'll need to meet with you both beforehand, discuss the solemnity of marriage, ensure you understand the commitment you're making. We understand, Reverend, Vaughn assured him. Better than most, I think. The journey home was filled with plans and dreams. With the ring on her finger and their future decided, Harriet felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. The homestead that had once seemed like a prison, then a burden, now represented possibility and promise. Spring unfolded around them in a rush of growth and renewal. The cattle grew sleek on fresh grass, more calves were born, and the garden Harriet planted began to sprout tender green shoots. Vaughn moved his few possessions from the barn to the cabin, though they maintained separate sleeping arrangements until the wedding. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked of practical matters, how many more cattle they could sustain, whether to build a new barn or expand the existing one. Other times they shared deeper thoughts, hopes for children, dreams of what their life might look like in 5 or 10 years. Do you ever miss Virginia? Harriet asked one evening as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky. Vaughn was quiet for a moment. I miss what it was, he finally said. The beauty of it, the sense of belonging, but that place doesn't exist anymore except in my memory. And Boston, do you think you'd like it there? He laughed. Can't imagine myself among all those fancy folks. Why, do you miss it? Harriet shook her head. Not the place itself. Sometimes I miss certain comforts, bookshops, music, theater, but not enough to trade this. She gestured to the vast landscape before them. This freedom. We could visit someday, Vaughn suggested. When the ranch is established, take a trip east, see those bookshops, hear that music. The idea of traveling together, of showing Vaughn her old world while creating their new one, filled Harriet with a quiet joy. I'd like that. As April progressed, preparations for the wedding occupied what little time they had between ranch chores. Harriet altered her best dress, adding lace from her trousseau to the collar and cuffs. Vaughn ordered a new shirt and vest from the general store's catalog. They invited the few neighbors within reasonable traveling distance and arranged for a small reception at the hotel. The day before the wedding, they made the trip to town together for the final time as an unmarried couple. Reverend Williams met with them for a last discussion of their intentions and the solemnity of marriage vows. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, he reminded them, especially in these harsh conditions. You must be prepared to face hardships together, to support each other through difficulty and danger. We already have, Harriet said simply, her hand finding Vaughn's. The Reverend smiled. Yes, I believe you have. Very well then, tomorrow at noon. That night, their last before becoming husband and wife, they sat later than usual by the fire. A strange mixture of excitement and nervousness hung in the air between them. Any regrets? Vaughn asked softly, watching the flames dance. Harriet considered the question seriously. Only that we didn't meet sooner, she finally said. Think of all the time we could have had. We have the rest of our lives, he reminded her, drawing her close for a kiss, and I plan to make every day count. When he left for the barn that night, his last night sleeping away from her, Harriet stood in the doorway watching him go, her heart full to bursting with love and anticipation. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, as if nature itself approved of their union. Harriet dressed carefully in her refurbished gown, arranging her hair with wildflowers instead of a formal veil. Looking in the small mirror, she hardly recognized herself, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with happiness. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Standing before Reverend Williams in the small church, with a handful of neighbors and townspeople as witnesses, Harriet and Vaughn exchanged vows in clear, steady voices. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn's kiss was tender but held the promise of passion to come. The small reception at the hotel was a surprisingly joyful affair. Even the bakers attended, James offering a somewhat grudging congratulations. Mrs. Gunderson brought a cake, and someone produced a fiddle for dancing. As Vaughn led Harriet in a waltz, she marveled at how different this felt from her first wedding, a stiff, formal affair arranged by her father, with a groom she barely knew. This time she was marrying a man she had chosen, a man whose strengths and weaknesses she understood, whose heart she knew as well as her own. "What are you thinking, Mrs. Quincy?" Vaughn asked, spinning her gently across the floor. The new name sent a thrill through her. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be," she replied. They left the celebration early, eager to return to their home now, truly shared. The ride back was filled with a sweet tension, both of them acutely aware of the night ahead. At the cabin door, Vaughn surprised Harriet by sweeping her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a grin, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, the familiar space seemed transformed by their new status. Vaughn had prepared a surprise: fresh linens on the bed, a bottle of wine he'd somehow procured from town, wildflowers in a jar on the table. "When did you do all this?" Harriet asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Had some help from Mrs. Baker," he admitted. "She came by while we were meeting with the Reverend yesterday." They shared the wine by firelight, talking softly of the day and their hopes for the future. When Vaughn finally took her hand and led her to the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Harriet felt not nervousness but a deep sense of rightness. Their lovemaking was tender at first, then increasingly passionate as they discovered each other fully for the first time. In Vaughn's arms, Harriet found a joy she had never known existed, a completion that went beyond physical pleasure to something profound and transformative. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms with her head on his chest, Harriet whispered, "I never knew it could be like this." Vaughn stroked her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Nor did I, and it's only the beginning, Harriet, only the beginning." The years that followed proved the truth of his words. The ranch prospered under their joint care, the herd growing steadily in both size and quality. The cabin expanded first with an additional bedroom, then a proper kitchen, and finally a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. Their family grew as well. The following spring brought their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Harriet's grandmother. 2 years later, a son followed, whom they called James after Vaughn's brother lost in the war. The children thrived in the freedom of the Colorado wilderness, growing strong and independent under their parents' loving guidance. As the territory developed, so did opportunities. Vaughn's skill with horses led to a sideline breeding business that eventually became as profitable as the cattle. Harriet's garden expanded into a small orchard, producing fruit that commanded premium prices in the growing town of Willow Creek. They faced hardships: 2 drought years when the creek ran low, harsh winters that threatened the herd, a fire that destroyed the barn and had to be rebuilt. But each challenge faced together only strengthened their bond, confirming what they had discovered that first winter. Together, they could weather any storm. On their 10th anniversary, Vaughn surprised Harriet with the trip east they had once discussed. They left the children with trusted neighbors and traveled by train to Boston, where Harriet showed Vaughn the world she had left behind. Standing in the public garden, watching swans glide across the pond, Harriet slipped her arm through her husband's. "Do you understand now why I left?" Vaughn surveyed the manicured lawns, the carefully tended flower beds, the well-dressed people strolling the paths. "It's beautiful," he acknowledged, "but like a painting, perfect and unchanging. Not like our place, always growing, always becoming something new." Harriet nodded. "Exactly. I needed room to become myself, not who others expected me to be." He kissed her temple. "And who are you, Harriet Quincy? Who have you become?" She considered the question, thinking of the scared young widow he had found that autumn day, comparing her to the confident woman she was now mother, rancher, partner. "I've become who I was always meant to be," she said simply. "Thanks to you." "Not thanks to me," Vaughn corrected gently. "With me, perhaps, beside me, but the strength was always in you, Harriet. I just helped you find it." They returned to Colorado renewed, appreciating their home and life with fresh eyes. The children were growing quickly, Elizabeth showing her mother's determination and her father's skill with horses, James revealing a thoughtful nature and an unexpected talent for figures. As the territory moved toward statehood, their ranch became one of the most respected in the county. The Quincy brand was known for quality cattle and exceptional horses. Harriet and Vaughn were sought out for advice by newcomers, their success a testament to what could be achieved through hard work and vision. On the 20th anniversary of the day Vaughn had ridden onto her homestead, Harriet stood on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. She heard his familiar step behind her and leaned back against his chest as his arms encircled her waist. "Happy anniversary," he murmured against her hair, now streaked with silver. 20 years, she marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you appeared at my door. Other times I can hardly remember life before you. Any regrets?" He asked, echoing the question he had posed the night before their wedding. Harriet turned in his arms to face him. The years had etched lines around his eyes and silvered his temples, but he was still handsome, still the man who had captured her heart that long ago winter. "Not one," she said firmly. "Every moment has been worth it." Over his shoulder, she could see their son bringing in the horses for the night, their daughter hanging washing on the line, the ranch buildings solid and well-maintained against the backdrop of mountains. The life they had built together surrounded them, tangible proof of what was possible when fear gave way to love, when the end of one dream became the beginning of another far greater than imagined. "I love you, Vaughn Quincy," she said, the words as true now as the first time she had spoken them in that snowy line shack. "Thank you for teaching me that love wasn't over, it was just beginning." He smiled, the same smile that had warmed her through 20 Colorado winters. "I love you too, Harriet Quincy, always have, always will." As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the vast Colorado sky, two people who had found in each other not just love, but home.